Thunderstorms, showcasing both the majesty and terror of nature. I think as kids we were all frightened at one time or another, but personally I really enjoy thunderstorms now. There's the light show and the thunder, but even just the gentle rain can put me at ease. However, it goes without saying that thunderstorms can still be scary under the right, or rather, wrong, circumstances. Here are 4 stories about their darker side, no pun intended. But before we get to them, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone who listens to these stories, or checks out my other videos. I know this channel is pretty random, and honestly, that's the way I like it. If you do happen to enjoy some of what I make, consider subscribing and leaving likes and comments. I think it would really help the channel out, but even if not, I'll still be stoked that a few people managed to find it. Anyway, I hope you enjoy these stories. Story 1. I've been a janitor at a local community college for around 5 years. It's a nicer campus where basically nothing ever happens. Every once in a while a group of skateboarders might show up, or someone might tag something, but that's it. However, about a year and a half ago, something terrifying did happen. To set the scene, it was a Tuesday night during a heavy downpour. There was lightning and thunder every several seconds, and I think this might have been the worst thunderstorm there's ever been since I've been here. The decision had been made to cancel classes at around 2 p.m., so campus was deserted and all the doors for the buildings had been locked. But me and my coworker were still required to finish out our shifts. I didn't particularly mind actually, since I always enjoyed a good storm. Our campus has 2 buildings separated by a small courtyard, and both buildings have a second floor. The room numbers in the first building all start with 1,000, so we call it the 1,000 building. As you can guess, the other building was the 2,000 building. Me and my coworker John were both in the 2,000 building cleaning the floors. John was downstairs using the floor scrubber while I was cleaning one of the bathrooms upstairs. Around 7 p.m. I finished in that particular bathroom and took my cart back outside. The hallway I was in had large windows on one side that looked across the courtyard to the 1,000 building. I stared outside for a moment, just admiring the light show, but as I did so, I saw something strange. The lights in one of the upstairs rooms in the 1,000 building began flickering off and on at a somewhat regular interval. It wasn't exactly regular, like a fluorescent light going out. Instead, it seemed like someone was in the room manually turning the switch off and on. I tried to look for someone, but even when a round of lightning synced up to when the lights were on, I couldn't see anything in that room. I left my cart where it was and walked downstairs to find John still using the scrubber. I almost thought he had been messing with me, but to be honest he wasn't really the type to play jokes on people. I told him what I saw and we walked over to one of the windows. The lights were still flickering. Just like me, John had no idea who or what could have been causing it. I should say at this point I wasn't really freaked out yet, since I assumed it could just be an electrical problem. Because I was almost done upstairs and John had a ways to go, I decided to be the one who would walk over. I got my umbrella from where I had put it on a table, and when I opened one of the doors to the outside, I was immediately hit by a gust of wind and rain. Luckily there was a somewhat covered walking area over part of the courtyard, so I didn't get drenched. I did almost lose my balance, but I didn't fall over. As I made it to the 1,000 building, I saw the light upstairs still flickering. Then I looked inside the double doors to the larger foyer. As I expected, the lights were all off and it was deserted. I unlocked one of the doors and stepped inside and stomped my boots on the thin rubber mat, and then set down my umbrella. The ground floor of this building had the cafeteria and a student services section and 2 main hallways, one leading to the left and the other to the right. Based on what room I saw the lights flickering in, I took the hallway to the left and then went up the stairs to the second floor and back into the main hallway there. I didn't bother turning on any of the hallway lights, since there was still some light from the exit signs and a few other places, and since I had my flashlight. As I stepped into the hall, I realized that the lights weren't flickering on in that room anymore. I think here is where I started to get creeped out. The occasional lightning and crashes of thunder didn't do much to put my mind at ease. Slowly, I made my way over to the room, and without shining my light into it, I peeked inside. It was completely deserted, and the lights were indeed off. This classroom had 2 doors, one near the front by the professor's desk, and the other at the back. Both were locked. With slight hesitation, I unlocked the one at the back of the classroom and stepped inside. Inside, the room things were completely normal. Nothing looked out of place, and none of the desks looked like they had been moved. I looked at the computer on the professor's desk and the overhead projector, but didn't seem to see anything like they'd been tampered with. I stopped for a moment and tried to think of what could have caused the lights to flicker. There was a light switch by each door, and both of them were clearly in the off position. I did one last 360 scan of the classroom and nothing stood out to me. There weren't any cabinets or closets in which someone could be hiding. I finally decided to walk back out and lock the door behind me. When I walked back into the hall, I could swear that I heard a metallic clink somewhere in the distance, like maybe someone dropped a pen or a screwdriver. I looked down the hallway and saw only the dim red glow of the exit signs, along with a few other dim lights. I debated about whether to walk down that hallway, but after a moment I convinced myself that it could have just been the thunder. I walked back down the stairs. I came out at the ground floor and walked quickly to the front doors, picked up my umbrella, walked outside, and locked the doors behind me. The storm was still raging, and as I got back to the 2000 building, I was again moderately wet. At this point, John had finished scrubbing the floors and was wrapping things up. He asked me what I saw, and I told him nothing, and there was an uncomfortable silence. We both had seen the lights go on and off, and I think we both suspected there could have been someone else in that building. I mean, what other explanation was there? I decided to go upstairs and finish cleaning the bathrooms, and that's exactly what I did. John helped me out, and 15 minutes later, we were done. I was glad. As we were about to go back downstairs, we took a look at the 1000 building from the same spot I had just seen the lights. To our horror, when the next lightning strike lit up the building, we saw a silhouette standing at each of the windows. Considering the light switches were by the doors leading to the hallway, that meant that there were at least 4 people in that room. My heart sank, and I'm pretty sure John's did as well. I ran to a nearby phone to call campus security and tell them what we just saw. As I was doing so, I heard John say, "Oh shit." I went back over and watched as a black hooded figure bolted out from the double doors of the 1000 building and started running in our direction. We thank God that we had locked the downstairs doors after we had come in, but soon enough we started to hear a manic banging from one of the windows or doors downstairs. John and I were both still upstairs, so we weren't exactly sure where. And it didn't start out as a tap or a knock. No, someone was smashing their fists against glass or metal. For a frantic moment, we decided what we should do before John turned the lights off and we opened up and ran into one of the classrooms. This one only had one door, and we pushed the teacher's desk up against it. From somewhere downstairs, we heard the sound of glass shattering and then a door opening, followed a few seconds later by shouting and the sound of footsteps running up the stairway. Then the sounds abruptly stopped. John and I held our breath as a minute passed. But just when we started to relax, we sprang back as manic pounding started on the door to our classroom. This time someone was screaming something incomprehensible, and I'm not even sure if it was more than one person. This went on for about 5 minutes until security showed up, and I can safely say that those were the longest 5 minutes of my entire life. I'll spare most of the remaining details because this is essentially where the story ends. Campus security and later the police arrived and took our statements. They easily found the door that was broken into, as well as several pairs of wet footprints leading from there up to the second floor where we were. It was then that I realized that I hadn't made sure to check if all the doors on the 1000 building were locked, and I kicked myself for that. But even so, someone in that group must have had a key to get back into that classroom and stand in front of the windows the second time. Long story short, they never found who did it. Maybe it was high schoolers or a YouTube prank, but I have no idea. What still gets me is how those people took their time messing with us in the beginning, and then transitioned rapidly to manically banging on the doors and breaking into the building. Needless to say, I was terrified to work in the late evenings for a while, but as more time passed, I started to feel more normal. However, anytime there's a thunderstorm, it can still send chills up my spine. Story 2. I live in Texas, and one Thanksgiving my fiancé and I were driving along I-10 from Austin to Houston to visit her family. Our names will be Ben and Trish for this story. This particular Thanksgiving there was a bad storm, and Trish's parents actually urged us not to come. For some reason I always enjoy driving in the rain. I just found it peaceful for whatever reason. However, this time I didn't think things through. Since it was Thanksgiving, the interstate was packed, and we had been averaging about 40 miles an hour. At around 2 p.m., when we were 2/3 the way to Houston, the rain really started coming down, and it started hailing. Trish and I got into an argument before I eventually agreed to look for something under which to park to ride out the worst of it. Unfortunately for us, the overpasses already had cars to the side, but the next exit had a gas station, so we went ahead and pulled off. When we got there, the covered area was almost completely full, but we managed to get one spot near the corner. While most people were in their cars or trucks, a few were standing near the middle pumps and were just watching the storm. Over Trish's objections, I opened the door to my truck and stepped outside. I was hit by a wall of rain, and the sound of the hail coming down got much louder. I told her I'd be back in just a minute and shut the door behind me. I walked over to where the other people were congregating, and we all marveled at the sky. The hail was about golf ball sized, so it was a great thing we found covered parking. Occasionally there'd be lightning and thunder, and one time it was particularly close. Some of the people started cheering. To be honest, there was a bit of a carnival atmosphere. Eventually I went back to my truck and climbed inside. Trish had pulled up the radar app on her phone and told me the worst should be over in about half an hour. Unfortunately, the traffic would probably be worse, since now there would be cars damaged by the hail. I asked Trish if she wanted anything from the gas station store, with the intent of sprinting over whenever the hail let up. She told me a bag of Doritos and a Diet Pepsi, and I planned on getting a few items for myself. After that, I went back outside and over to the group of people. After a moment, one of them walked right up to me. It actually caught me by surprise because he literally stopped like 2 feet from my face. At first he didn't say anything, which I found incredibly awkward, so I asked him if he needed something. After a moment, he stuck out his hand and said his name was Dale. I shook his hand, and he gave me an almost dead fish handshake. Dale had kind of a neckbeard and looked to be in his late 30s. He was wearing a faded, ripped t-shirt and shorts and tennis shoes, and his breath was horrible. I again asked him if he needed anything, but he just smiled. It was extremely off-putting, but I suspected that Dale had a mental issue, so I tried to be as polite as I could. However, with how bad his breath was and how close he was to me, that was proving to be difficult. After what seemed like a minute, he told me he liked my truck. It was an older F-150, nothing special, but I thanked him for the compliment. I expected him to walk away at that point, but he kept standing there. Next he asked me if I needed anything, and I wasn't quite sure how to respond to that. At first I told him, "No, I'm good," but then he asked me again. "What do you mean?" I asked him. Dale didn't say anything, but instead pointed at the store. Mind you, the hail was still coming down, and there was about a 20-foot gap between the covered area with the gas pumps and the awning of the convenience store. I told Dale that I didn't need anything from there, to which he frowned a bit. But what he said next was very annoying and creepy. Dale literally reminded me that Trish had asked me for a bag of Doritos and a Diet Pepsi. It caught me completely off guard, and out of surprise I asked him how he knew that. Dale told me he had overheard us talking in my truck, and so neither me nor Trish had noticed him. I almost called him out then and there, but because I thought he had an issue, I restrained myself. I low-key started looking around to see who he could have come with, as I didn't think he could have driven there by himself. I couldn't tell what person or persons that might be, so I asked Dale who he came with, to which he said nothing. But then he started to slowly smile again, and I was completely creeped out. I told him I needed to return to my truck, and after he didn't say anything, I turned around, walked back, and got inside. Trish was still on her phone, but noticed me continuing to stare at my window. Dale was still standing where he had been talking, and he was looking right at me. Trish asked me what was up, and I told her about the conversation I just had. Needless to say, she was creeped out as well, and I made sure to keep my eye on Dale so he couldn't listen in on us again. After what seemed like 10 minutes, I decided to get out of my truck to politely ask Dale to mind his own business. But right when I opened the door, Dale full-on sprinted to the convenience store. The group of people still standing outside fell silent, and a few people let out gasps as Dale ran through the wind, rain, and hail and then into the doors. It was so unexpected that I literally didn't have time to react after I stepped down. We all watched as a minute or two later Dale came out with a bag in his hand and sprinted back to the cars. He was completely soaked, and I think he had a small cut on his forehead, likely from the hail. He walked right over to me again, and without looking I could already guess what was in the bag. To my dismay, I was right. It was Doritos and a Diet Pepsi. I didn't know what to say. Normally I'd express gratitude, but with how strange and creepy the situation was, I wasn't sure. Dale, of course, didn't say anything, so it was up to me to break the silence, though I wouldn't necessarily call it that because there was still the storm. "What do you have in the bag?" I ended up saying. Then without him saying a word, Dale held up the bag to me. I waited a moment or two and then took it. I looked at him and tried to make a smile, but all I wanted to do was get back in my truck. When Dale still didn't say anything, I finally said thank you and walked away. Trish had been watching the whole thing, and when I opened the door, she looked very concerned. She became alarmed when I told her what just happened and showed her what was in the bag. But nothing could prepare us for what happened next. Trish had turned to face me while she was looking in the bag, but when she turned back to look forward, she screamed. I turned around and almost jumped in my seat. There was Dale, 2 feet from Trisha's window, staring right at her. That was the last straw. I forcefully opened my door and jumped out of my truck. I walked quickly around the front, stepped right in front of Dale, and yelled, "What?" In classic Dale fashion, he didn't say anything. He also had a blank expression and just stared right at me. I repeated myself, saying, "What is your deal?" but nothing happened. At that point, I walked back over to the group of people near the center of the covered area and asked if anyone knew Dale. I was still assuming that he had come with someone, since he obviously had mental issues. But no one knew who he was or who he came with. After about 30 seconds, I went back to my truck, since Dale was still standing right outside Trisha's window. Or at least he had been standing outside her window. As I walked around to Trisha's side, I saw her trying to get my attention. I opened her door and she told me that after I walked away, Dale just ran into the rain. And not to the convenience store again, but literally just out into a field by the gas station. I was dumbfounded. Someone in a car nearby had also seen him and came out to ask if we knew that person. I said no, and he looked just as confused as me. After that man and I went back to the group of people, as well as everyone in their cars, and asked if they knew anything about what just happened. No one did, and no one had noticed when he showed up. I and a group of 3 people who wanted to get things at the convenience store ran quickly through the rain and hail. It was still hailing, mind you, and stepped inside. While buying stuff, we asked the cashier if she had seen Dale earlier. She told us that she saw him in the store, but that he walked back out without buying anything or using the restroom. It seems he had shoplifted the Doritos and Diet Pepsi that he had given to me and Trish, and the cashier apparently didn't notice when he reached around the counter to grab a bag. Nothing happened after that. We waited at the gas station for another half hour or so before the rain and hail started to let up, then we got back on the road. Traffic was bad, as we had expected, but luckily there weren't any more incidents and we arrived at Trisha's parents' house safely. What happened with Dale still leaves me with a bunch of questions, such as how and why did he come to the gas station during a hailstorm? And why did he approach me and Trish? I know I'll never know, but it still stands out as one of the creepiest experiences I've ever had in my entire life. Story 3. When I was a sophomore in high school, our class took a field trip to one of the nearby museums. On this particular day, we were visiting a natural history museum, complete with fossils and dinosaur bones. I'd been there several times before, and this place was pretty big. I think it had 3 levels, including a basement and a fair number of exhibits. I remember that the basement had stuff on different geologic time periods, as well as dinosaur skeletons, while the main floor had interactive demonstrations of the water cycle and that kind of stuff. The upper level had some kind of traveling exhibit on sharks, I think. Anyway, it was a Friday, close to the end of the school year I might add, so most of my class was checked out. I and my 2 friends, who I'll call Meg and Jess, sat together on the bus ride over and talked quietly while the rest of our classmates were goofing off pretty loudly. As we rode over, we couldn't help but notice the very ominous sky, and Jess started joking that we were going to get sucked up by a tornado. Apparently the forecast had predicted storms, but the school still decided to go ahead with the field trip. And really, we only had to walk the short distance from where the bus let us out to the front doors. Once we got inside the museum, everything was about what you'd expect. Our teacher, who I'll call Mr. A, had given the class an assignment where we'd each have to go around finding answers to put on a worksheet. To make sure we didn't just look stuff up on our phones, we had to put down where the exhibit was. Mr. A told us that we could work with a partner or groups of 3, but of course essentially all the boys just formed one big mob. Jess and Meg and I weren't really part of the other clique of girls that was in our class, so we just walked around by ourselves. I'm not sure when it started raining, or raining heavily, but at some point one of the boys in our class started walking around telling people we were meeting back in the main lobby. We were kind of upset since we barely had any time to start filling out the sheet, but when we met up with the rest of our class, we noticed Mr. A looking concerned. He was usually a pretty laid-back guy, so seeing him like that was a bit unusual. Mr. A apologized for calling us back so soon, and told us that the weather was getting very bad and we needed to leave. Sure enough, we could see only a dim amount of light as well as rain coming down in sheets through the windows. This was a bit unexpected, since we got to the museum around noon and it wasn't even 1 p.m. yet. That's when I noticed him. Across from our group of students, I saw a guy standing all by himself, looking in our direction. I might have just assumed he was an employee, but something about him was just off-putting. He wasn't wearing any kind of uniform or nice clothes, just a t-shirt and blue jeans. He looked to be in his mid-30s, old enough to be a dad, but he didn't seem to be with a family. After zoning out for about 30 seconds, I began to notice that he had started looking more in our direction. And I don't mean just at our class. No, this guy was looking right at me, Meg, and Jess. I started to feel a bit unnerved, but felt relieved when Mr. A told us to make our way to the doors as the buses would soon be there. That feeling was short-lived, however, as next thing we knew, he was telling us to step back into the middle of the lobby. Apparently the bus drivers or someone else from the school decided it would be too dangerous to try to drive back right now, and honestly that made sense. In addition to the sheets of rain, we could now hear and see hail coming down outside. A few of us checked our phones, and apparently things were going to get worse. And the storm was going to be here for a few hours. Mr. A spoke to people at the school, and it was decided that we just stay at the museum until it became safe to drive back. The boys started shouting and running around, while Meg, Jess, and I didn't particularly care. Don't get us wrong, we think science and biology are alright, but it just wasn't our thing. Eventually Mr. A told us we could go back to walking around and working on our worksheets while he monitored the weather. Meg, Jess, and I decided to walk back to the basement level to finish the 3 more things we were pretty sure were down there. After a few minutes, we found the exhibit we needed, which was a model of the ocean showing the tectonic plates underneath. We all put our sheets on the top of the plastic cover and started filling them out. Just then Meg gasped as we looked up. A few exhibits away, we saw someone. It was the same man from earlier. Half his body was hidden by a wooden beam, almost as if he were trying to hide from us. When he noticed us notice him, he walked out and shot us a smirk. We didn't say anything, but to our disappointment, he began walking over to us. When he was like 5 feet away, he stopped and introduced himself as Harry. He asked us if we were working on a school project. I think all 3 of us felt that should have been obvious, given that he had seen our whole class in the lobby and each of us had our paper and pencils out. Either Meg or Jess answered yes, as the other 2 of us just looked at him, not knowing what to say. Then Harry, or whatever his name was, asked what our assignment was on. Again, that should have been obvious, given that we were right at one of the exhibits. Harry continued to ask us pointless questions until I finally told him that we had to go, and we started making our way to the stairs. Then Harry did something unexpected that freaked us out. Believe it or not, once he saw we were going to the stairs, he actually moved in front of us and started grinning. It was beyond creepy, and I, who I consider to be the most outgoing member of our group, told him we needed to get by. He still stood there though, and it seemed like he was almost starting to laugh. He even started to playfully wave his index finger back and forth like this was all a joke. We had had enough of this, and I forcefully pushed past the man's shoulder. Meg and Jess followed me. The man kept being playful and pretended to be hurt, but I was too pissed to care and just wanted to get away from him. Luckily, there were more people on the ground floor, which had the lobby and then a few hallways with exhibits surrounding it. We needed like 5 things from this floor, so we just picked an area that seemed less crowded and started there. As we made our way around the floor in a circular fashion, we couldn't help shake the feeling that we were being watched. And then, to no one's surprise, we caught another glimpse of Harry. He was standing about 20 feet away, peeking out from around the corner leading to the hallway we were in. Only this time, when he noticed us, he went back out of view. Not that what he did before wasn't creepy, but this time it was a bit more disturbing. We were all like, whatever, and just finished up on the main floor. There were only 2 things we needed on the upper floor, so we were hoping it wouldn't take as long. Before we went up, we tried to find where Harry was standing so that we could be sure he wasn't up there waiting for us. Jess said we should let Mr. A know, which in hindsight was probably a great suggestion. For whatever reason though, we felt a bit awkward telling him. Anyway, we caught another glimpse of Harry standing on the far side of the lobby, this time not looking at us. The upper level was also smaller, and we heard more of our classmates up there, so we felt safer. We made our way to the main staircase and started walking up. Like we expected, it didn't take us long. After we finished the last item on our worksheet, there wasn't really much else to do, so we just sat and talked. Eventually the other students who were up there with us walked back downstairs. And as we learned later, they started messing around in the basement level and actually broke something. Now it was quiet upstairs, aside for the sound of rain on the roof. There weren't any windows in this little upper level, so we couldn't look out at the storm. What happened next was the most terrifying moment of my life. I know it sounds silly, but it was like something from a cliché horror movie. Just as we were debating about whether or not to walk back downstairs, the lights went out. The air conditioner and some of the other background noises stopped, meaning the power had gone out. When that happened, we each froze and looked around. The red glow of the exit signs was just barely enough to let us see the way back to the staircase. Then Jess gasped, and a second later me and Meg saw what she was looking at. There, in the faint red light, was the outline of a person. Each of us already knew who it was. He was standing about 10 feet away from the stairs, and it seemed like he was trying to hide behind part of the exhibit. Thankfully, it seemed like he didn't notice that we noticed him. Without saying a word, we all began walking slowly to the staircase. Once we were almost to the top of it, we saw the man move out of the corner of our eyes, and we started running down the stairs. I thought I heard him running after us, but I'm not sure. At any rate, he wasn't right behind us when we got to the bottom. When we did, it seemed like the rest of our class was already there. There were more emergency lights in the lobby, so we could see a bit better. We kept looking at the staircase, but we didn't see the man again. Apparently he just stayed up there. We now had a decision to make. We could have told Mr. A and the museum staff about the man that was stalking us, or just stay close to Mr. A and wait to get back on the buses. We went with the second option, and looking back, I feel bad. Who knows if that man went after other girls, or if he would have come back to the museum someday. At least if the staff knew about him, they could be on the lookout. Anyway, the lights came on about 15 minutes later and the storm started letting up. We were able to get back on the buses and head back to school before the end of the school day, so we just took our normal buses home as usual. I still think about what happened from time to time. Who knows if that man was armed, and how close we were to getting attacked or even kidnapped. I just hope that he wasn't able to succeed with any of his plans. Story 4. There's a forest preserve with miles of hiking trails not far from where I live. And after work and on the weekends, I frequently head over there to walk around. It helps me relieve stress. However, one time I went there will go down in infamy as the scariest experience of my entire life. Cut to one Sunday afternoon. Clouds were building, but according to the forecast, there wouldn't be anything more than a slight drizzle, which I honestly didn't mind. I decided to hit the trails and took a backpack with water, some snacks, and one of the small foldable umbrellas just in case. I usually hiked for around 2 hours when I went there, and based on what I saw on the app, I'd probably be back before the rain even started. So we walked about a quarter of a mile down the road to get to the trailhead, then I turned onto the small asphalt path. One of the things I really liked about the trails was the variety. There were paths through forests, up the sides of hills, through fields, and through a creek bed. Some of them were paved, like the one I was currently on, and some were just dirt or small rocks. I think it's called crushed granite, but I can't remember. About 30 minutes into my walk, I started to feel tiny drops, but I decided to just keep going. I didn't even open the umbrella for a while, but eventually I did. However, after another half hour, it started to downpour. It was actually pretty sudden, and it caught me by surprise. Unfortunately, I was at the furthest part away from my house, and it'd take another hour or so to get back. Fortunately, though, there was a small bird blind nearby, so I ran for 2 minutes to get to it and then walked inside. It wasn't anything fancy. It was literally just 3 small walls made out of sticks with a piece of metal on top for a roof. It wasn't used for hunting either, just for bird watching. Inside was one of those information signs that talked about the different types of birds you could see there. The bird blind was on the boundary between a field and part of the forest, and you could also see a pond from it. I suppose that's probably why they put it there. When I got there, I was pretty much soaked, and even though there were wooden benches inside, rain kept blowing in from between the sticks used for walls. As I sat, my back and pants kept getting wet. The water striking the metal roof was also pretty loud. Either way, I was just glad to be out of the rain. I checked the app on my phone, and to my dismay, there were now supposed to be thunderstorms for the next 2 hours. I contemplated my options. I decided to stay for another 15 minutes or so to see if the rain let up any, and if not, I guess I'd just get back to one of the paved trails and run all the way home. So, there I sat, doing my best to just appreciate nature. I actually liked thunderstorms and didn't really mind sitting in the bird blind. Something about being in the relatively isolated wilderness also made it cooler for some reason. 15 minutes later and the storm hadn't really let up, and I decided on whether I should wait longer. I didn't have anything else I had to do that day, so potentially I could just ride out the storm. However, right around that time I noticed something in the distance. From my peripheral vision I saw a bright orange color, and when I turned my head to look at it, I noticed it was a man, wearing an orange safety vest. He was about 100 yards away and walking towards the bird blind. I figured he was just trying to get out of the rain like I was, but I noticed he was walking slowly. Like, really slowly. Eventually I put 2 and 2 together and figured that he might have some kind of problem and couldn't walk quickly, and I decided to see if I could help him. I stepped out into the rain, getting absolutely drenched, and jogged over to the man. As I came up to him, I said over the sound of the rain, "Hey, let me help you to the bird blind." It was at that point I started to get creeped out. I saw that the man was a lot younger than I was expecting. In fact, he looked to be in his late 20s, and he was smiling. I also saw that he was wearing business attire underneath a safety vest, and all of that without an umbrella, so we were both getting drenched. I was taken aback by the encounter, but I still wanted to get out of the rain. I repeated my request, and the man seemed to nod and follow me. I started jogging back, but when I got there I turned around and saw the man still out in the rain. It seemed like he was still walking at his same pace. 30 seconds later he arrived at the bird blind, and things continued being awkward. If only I knew it was about to get so much worse. I was sitting on one of the benches, and there were 2 others on the other 2 walls. Now, any normal person might have sat down on one of the other benches, but the man sat down right next to me. And when I say right next to, I mean literally like 4 inches away. I would have tried not to make eye contact, but I figured that was pretty much futile. So instead I turned to look at him to break the silence. Then I jumped back as he was looking right at me. I think he must have noticed that because he smiled, laughed slightly, and stuck out his hand. I shook his hand, and he shook vigorously. The man introduced himself as Carson and asked me what my name was. I didn't tell him my real name, but for the purposes of this story, I'll call myself Mark. Carson then immediately asked me what my last name was, which I found very off-putting. I said nothing for a moment, then told him I'd prefer to keep that private. I don't think I sounded confident when I said that, but the question had just caught me so off guard. However, nothing could have prepared me for where things would go next. Without even hesitating, Carson asked me what I thought about God. If I hadn't known what to say before, I sure as hell didn't know what to say now. After a moment, I told Carson I'd like to keep that private as well, and he didn't say anything immediately after that. But that didn't change the fact that I now wanted to leave the bird blind immediately. Unfortunately, it was raining as hard as ever. I was still processing things when Carson asked me, "Have you ever thought about your beliefs?" That was it. I told him that I wasn't interested and got up to leave. That's when things went from creepy to terrifying. Carson got up too and walked in front of me, seemingly to block my way. My fight or flight response kicked in and I immediately started walking, almost hitting him. I started jogging and not full on sprinting so that it wouldn't seem like I was fleeing. Every few seconds I tried to turn my head to the side as discreetly as possible and look behind me. Carson was still standing in the bird blind, watching me. Right before the path started to turn where I would lose sight of him, my blood ran cold. I noticed a second person in a bright orange vest nearby, so apparently he wasn't alone. As I rounded the corner, I began to run, and soon made it back to the paved trail. Now it was around 3.5 miles to get back to the trailhead and then to my house. Eventually I realized that I was both hungry and thirsty, but I didn't want to stop just yet. After running for a mile or so, I slowed down a bit and pulled my backpack off. I reached in for the bottle of water and a granola bar and ate and drank quickly. I put the backpack back on and continued to haul ass until I almost got back to the trailhead. I say almost because right before I got there, I spotted 2 more people in orange vests and my blood ran cold. After my encounter with Carson and seeing that other person, I figured they were working for some kind of religious organization. Now, I consider myself a somewhat religious person, and I never knock anyone else's beliefs. But I think that any reasonable person would agree that how Carson was sharing his beliefs was way too aggressive. In any case, I hadn't expected him and his friend to be part of a larger operation. And I didn't know what group they were affiliated with. They didn't seem similar to anyone who had ever knocked on my door or come up to me on the street before. I slowed to a walk for a moment to evaluate my choices, but really there wasn't any other good way to get back to the street or my house. So I started to jog again and resolved to not stop and talk if they talked to me. That's just what they did, and I waved and smiled but didn't slow down. I saw a blue Honda Civic parked nearby on the side of the road, which I assumed belonged to them. Another couple of minutes and I got to my house. Now, I had been looking back and hadn't thought I'd been followed, but just to be on the safe side, I went behind one of my neighbor's houses 3 doors down and then made my way through our backyards. I got to my back patio without incident and let myself in. Obviously, I was still paranoid, so after I dried off and put on fresh clothes, I closed all of the blinds and curtains and would periodically check one of the windows and my front and back door. My house wasn't that big and had only 1 floor, and I'd say I lived in a somewhat nicer neighborhood. I had a girlfriend, but she didn't live with me, and I didn't have any pets, so I was completely alone. I considered texting or calling one of my friends to see if they wanted to hang out, and I thought about saying something to the police, but ultimately I decided against that. Instead, I just texted some of my friends and told them what happened. They all agreed that it was insanely creepy. We started a group chat and put our heads together, trying to figure out what group Carson and the other people could have been with. But really, we had no idea. I think Jehovah's Witnesses had knocked on my door once a long time ago, but they had never been that aggressive. And I also figured they wouldn't be out walking through a forest in a thunderstorm to try to find other people to talk to. After about an hour or so, I started to relax a bit, and I turned the TV on and got some leftovers out of the fridge. It was starting to get dark, and while the thunderstorm wasn't as bad as it had been, it was still raining a moderate amount. I put a styrofoam container with Thai food on my coffee table and sat down on my couch. My blood ran cold as I heard my doorbell. A few seconds later, as I was walking over to my door, I heard a loud knock. I froze. It seemed that whoever was on the other side of that door was being aggressive, and I debated about whether or not I should answer it. There was a window where whoever was at the door could see me coming, so it would be hard to check the peephole without them noticing I was there. Eventually they knocked again, and my fight or flight response kicked in. I walked right up to the door and looked through the peephole. On the other side were 2 people I didn't recognize, not in orange safety vests, but still in nice clothes. I said very loudly, "Can I help you?" They asked to come in, and I bluntly told them I wasn't interested and to go away. Thankfully at that, they turned around and walked back off my porch. Just then I noticed that same Honda Civic, sending another chill down my spine. Now I'm not sure if the 2 people who came to my porch had seen me earlier that day or knew who I was. However, I did see them get into the Civic. After they did so, I expected them to drive off, but to my surprise and dismay, they just continued to sit there. I was still at the peephole waiting for them to leave, but they didn't. After 5 minutes, I grabbed my baseball bat, came back and opened the door, and walked aggressively down my sidewalk. The car turned its lights on and sped away, and I yelled after them to never come back. At that point, I reported what happened to the police, and an officer showed up to take a statement. He also walked around the outside of my house, and luckily there wasn't anyone hiding in a bush or anything. I got a home security system installed about a week later, but it took some time before I stopped feeling uneasy. I still think about what happened practically every day, and it freaks me out. Because Carson and his friend came up to me at a secluded location where there wouldn't be other people around, I think it's possible that they were from a cult and were looking for people to kidnap. I don't think they targeted me specifically, but who knows. Maybe the people at the trailhead were supposed to be lookouts to stop others from entering the trails, and maybe they wore safety vests to look more official and get people to follow their instructions. I'll never know. I just know that it was the most terrifying experience I've ever had.